The emergency room had been dark for 11 minutes when the helicopter went down. 6 Navy SEALs, 1 collapsed lung, 1 arterial bleed that had already soaked through 2 compression dressings, 1 airway closing so fast the attending physician stood frozen, hands shaking, looking at a patient he didn't know how to save. Director Randall Pruitt stood in the middle of the chaos and pointed at the one nurse he had spent 3 years trying to destroy. "You want to be so indispensable?" His voice cut through the alarms. "Prove it." Nobody in that room knew what she had done before she ever put on a nursing badge. Nobody knew what was coming. If this story gets under your skin, and I promise it will, follow along until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all started unraveling began the way most bad days do at Merrick Naval Medical Center. Not with a crisis, but with paperwork. Nora Callahan arrived at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift, the way she always did. The fluorescent lights in the staff corridor were still stuttering from the overnight power fluctuation, the 3rd one this week, and she made a mental note to add it to the maintenance log she'd been keeping since February. The log that nobody read. The log that sat in a manila folder on her desk beside 2 other folders, one for the backup generator service record she'd requested and been denied, and one for the mass casualty protocol she'd rewritten herself after the hospital's existing plan had failed a tabletop drill so badly that 3 of the 6 simulated patients would have been dead before triage was complete. She set her bag down in the break room, poured herself half a cup of coffee she'd drink maybe 2 sips of, and opened her locker. The note was taped to the inside door. "You're being moved to General Medical. Effective today." Administration. No name. No signature beyond that single word. No explanation. She stood there reading it twice, then folded it and put it in her pocket. Delia Marsh, the night shift charge nurse, came in behind her pulling off her jacket. Delia had worked nights at Merrick for 9 years and had the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything the hospital did. "You saw?" Delia asked. "Just now. Pruitt announced it at the end of evening rounds last night. Said you'd been reassigned for departmental restructuring." Delia made the quotation marks with her fingers, slow and deliberate. 3 people asked what that meant. He didn't answer. Nora pulled her stethoscope from the locker hook and hung it around her neck. "Which floor?" 4, Mrs. Prideaux's unit. Delia paused. "Nora, that's where they put people they want to forget about." "I know what floor 4 is." "You're not going to fight it?" Nora looked at her. "I'm going to go do my job." She said it without bitterness, which was the part Delia found hardest to watch. Merrick Naval Medical Center sat on the edge of Delacove Naval Station, a mid-size installation on the Carolina coast that had been there long enough to accumulate the particular institutional weight of a place that believed its own traditions more than its own data. The hospital served active duty personnel, their families, and overflow from the civilian county hospital 12 miles inland. It had 2 trauma bays, a surgical suite that needed renovation, and an emergency department that ran on a staffing model designed for patient volumes from 8 years ago. Nora had been there for 3 years. Before Merrick, she'd been somewhere else entirely, doing work that didn't appear on any resume she'd ever submitted. But the people at Merrick didn't know that, and she hadn't told them. And for a long time that had felt like the right choice. She had come to Merrick because it was quiet, because it was structured, because she thought she could do good work inside the lines without the weight of everything that had happened before pressing down on her every time she walked into a trauma bay. That had worked for a while. Then she'd started noticing the problems. The first time she brought a concern to Randall Pruitt, it was about the ventilator maintenance schedule. 3 of the 8 trauma-grade vents had service dates more than 14 months overdue. She put it in writing. She brought the documentation. She was professional, specific, and calm. Pruitt had looked at her across his desk with the particular expression of a man who had decided, before she walked in, that what she was about to say didn't matter. "I'll have someone look into it," he said. "The service records show—" "I said I'll have someone look into it, Callahan." The vents were not serviced. She checked again 6 weeks later. The second time she brought the backup generator logs. The unit had failed twice during testing. Actual testing, not the summary reports that went to the administrative board, which somehow showed green across all categories. She laid the raw logs on his desk. She had highlighted the failure timestamps in yellow. Pruitt looked at the logs for approximately 4 seconds. Where did you get these? From the maintenance office. They're not restricted documents. Did someone give you access, or did you go looking for something to complain about? She felt the shift in the room, the way the conversation had moved from the problem she was raising to her behavior in raising it, and she kept her voice level. The generator failed under load both times they tested it. If we lose primary power during a mass casualty event, we don't have reliable backup. That's not a complaint. That's a safety condition. I think you should focus on your patients, Callahan. I am focusing on my patients. And leave the facility operations to people who are responsible for facility operations. She took her highlighted logs and left his office. The third time, she went over his head to the Naval Station's medical oversight coordinator, a captain named Desmond Webb, who was polite, attentive, and forwarded her concerns directly back to Pruitt with a note asking him to address them at his discretion. That was the month Pruitt stopped speaking to her directly. He started using intermediaries. The charge nurse would pass along schedule changes, room reassignments, small exclusions that didn't look like anything individually but accumulated into a pattern she recognized. The systematic removal of someone from rooms where decisions got made. She got used to eating lunch alone. She got used to walking into conversations that stopped when she arrived. She kept filing reports. Well, the thing about Randall Pruitt was that he wasn't stupid. He was something more dangerous than stupid. He was smart in the particular way that institutional men sometimes are, which meant he understood that the easiest way to neutralize someone was not to attack them directly, but to erode the ground they stood on. He started with her reputation. Not through anything explicit. Nothing that could be pointed to in a grievance hearing. Just the consistent, low-level suggestion that Nora Callahan was difficult, that she had trouble working within a team, that her clinical instincts were good, but her interpersonal skills were problematic. She means well, he would say, and the phrase was precise because means well is the thing you say about someone whose judgment you don't trust. By the time her third year started, she had the highest patient outcome scores in the emergency department and the fewest friends on the floor. She was aware of both of these facts. She kept showing up anyway. The morning she was moved to floor 4, she reported to the general medical unit without incident. The floor was quieter than the ER. Long-term recovery cases, post-surgical patients, a few complex chronic conditions. The work was real work. She didn't discount it, but it was not what she was trained for, and everyone on the floor knew it, even if they didn't know why. The charge nurse on 4, a man named Tomas Berrigan, shook her hand when she arrived. "I know why you're here," he said, which was more than most people offered. "I'm just here to work," she said. "Fair enough." He handed her a patient board. "We've got a post-op hip in 408 who keeps pulling his compression stockings off. If you can fix that, you're already ahead of the last 3 nurses we had." She almost smiled. It wasn't the emergency department, but she could do this. The hurricane showed up on the National Weather Service models 11 days before it made landfall. By day 7, it had a name, Florence, which seemed almost too gentle for what the tracking maps were showing. By day 4, the storm had intensified to Category 3 and was trending directly for the coastline at a projected path that would hit Delacove Naval Station and everything around it with sustained winds over 120 miles per hour and a storm surge the County Emergency Management Office was calling unprecedented for this section of coast. The station began emergency protocols. Non-essential personnel were moved inland. Dependents were evacuated. The hospital went into lockdown preparedness mode, which meant, among other things, that Pruitt held a mandatory all-staff briefing on day 3 to outline the emergency response plan. Nora attended. She sat in the back and listened to him describe the mass casualty protocol, the one she'd flagged 18 months ago, the one that had failed the tabletop drill, as robust and fully operationalized. She listened to him describe the backup generator as recently serviced and fully compliant, which was not true, and she knew it was not true because she still had the logs. She listened to him describe staffing coverage as optimized for surge capacity, when she knew from the actual scheduling sheets that 3 of the 7 emergency nurses scheduled for hurricane coverage had requested hardship transfers in the past 6 weeks, and 2 of those requests had been approved. When he asked if there were any questions, she raised her hand. Pruitt looked at her for a moment before he called on her. "The generator," she said. When was it last load tested? A pause. Recently, he said. I have the maintenance log showing 2 load test failures in the past 14 months. Has there been a successful load test since then? The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the silence of people who didn't know what was happening, but the silence of people who did, and were waiting to see which direction it broke. Pruitt's jaw tightened. I think your concern has been noted, Callahan. I'm asking specifically whether the generator has been successfully load tested since February. And I'm telling you, your concern has been noted. Does anyone else have questions? Nobody raised their hand. She sat back down. She already knew what she was going to do when the storm hit. The hurricane made landfall at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday, which meant the worst of it arrived in the dark, the way the worst things usually do. By 4 a.m., primary power to the station had failed. By 4:09 a.m., the backup generator had attempted to engage and failed. By 4:11 a.m., Merrick Naval Medical Center was running on emergency battery reserves, which were designed to keep critical systems alive for approximately 90 minutes. Nora was already in the building. She had come in the previous afternoon and had not left. She'd told the floor 4 charge nurse she was staying through the storm. Tomas had looked at her with an expression that suggested he understood this was about more than wanting to help with hip replacement patients, and he'd given her a cot in the break room and not asked any questions. When the lights went out, she was already moving. She went to the supply closet she had quietly stocked over the previous 2 days. She had been careful about it, not drawing attention, taking things in small amounts, cataloging what she had and what was missing. She had 2 surgical airway kits, 4 chest seal sets, 3 units of O-negative blood from the supply that the ER hadn't properly logged in the chaos of storm preparation, IV setups, pressure dressings, a laryngoscope with battery backup, and the portable ultrasound that had been sitting in a storage room since the newer model arrived in January. She put what she could carry in a trauma bag. She went to the emergency department. The ER was not running smoothly. The battery reserves were keeping the monitors alive and the suction running, but nothing else, and the staff on shift were operating by flashlight and the pale blue glow of equipment screens. The attending on duty, a hospitalist named Dr. Warren Fitch, who had drawn the short straw for hurricane coverage, was managing 3 storm-related injury cases with 2 nurses and an aide. He looked up when Nora walked in. "You're not assigned here," he said. Not hostile, just tired and stating a fact. "I know. I have supplies." He looked at the bag. "From where?" "I've been building a cache for the past 2 weeks. You don't have enough chest seal material in this bay. You don't have a working large-bore airway kit, and your ultrasound is in storage." "How do you know what we have in this bay?" "Because I've been watching this department for 3 years, and I've read every supply audit report since I got here. I know what's here, and I know what's not." She set the bag on the counter. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to help if you'll let me." Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his 2 nurses, one of whom gave a small, honest shrug that communicated more than words would have. "Okay," he said. "Stay." She stayed. For the next 40 minutes, they worked the existing cases. A station worker with a laceration across the forearm from wind-driven debris. A family member who'd sheltered in place and taken a fall down a stairwell and had a probable wrist fracture and a scalp wound that bled the way scalp wounds do, dramatically and not dangerously. A mechanic from the motor pool with a pneumothorax from a piece of metal that had come through a window. This was the case that had been eating at Fitch when she arrived, because they had 1 chest seal left, and he'd used it, and he'd been watching the man's oxygen saturation trend down and trying to figure out what he was going to do next. Nora opened the bag and pulled out a chest seal set. Fitch looked at it the way a drowning man looks at a rope. "You want to tell me how exactly you—" "Not right now," she said, and handed it to him. The mechanic's sat climbed back into the 90s within 4 minutes of placement. Pruitt arrived in the emergency department at 4:58 a.m. He was dressed, which meant he'd been awake, which meant someone had called him about the generator failure. He walked into the bay and stopped when he saw Nora. His face did the thing it did, the controlled rearrangement of expression that she had learned to read as the moment before he decided what the situation required. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Working," she said. You're assigned to floor 4. Floor 4 doesn't have any patients who need what I have right now. This department does. That's not your call to make. Dr. Fitch cleared his throat from the other side of the bay. Director, she has supplies we didn't have, and I asked her to stay. Under the circumstances, I'm responsible for staffing assignments. Pruitt's voice was calm, which was its own kind of warning. Callahan, you need to return to your assigned floor. Randall, Fitch started. Warren, I'm not asking. Nora looked at Pruitt. She looked at the mechanic in Bay 2, whose oxygen saturation was now 94 and climbing. She looked at the supply bag on the counter, which still had 2 more chest seal sets and an airway kit nobody else in this building knew was there. I'll go back to 4, she said. She picked up the bag. Leave the bag, Pruitt said. She stopped. The supplies stay with the department where they're needed, he said. You can go. She set the bag on the counter. She walked out. She was halfway back to the elevator when she heard it. The sound that anyone who has worked in a trauma environment learns to identify before they consciously process it. The particular quality of radio noise from the helipad frequency that means something is coming in wrong. She stopped in the corridor. The radio at the nurse's station 10 feet away was live. The overnight charge nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had been managing paperwork because there was nothing else to manage, was leaning toward it with her head tilted. Repeat, Merrick Medical, this is Condor 7-2 declaring emergency. We are inbound with 6 KIA. A burst of static. Correction, 6 critical combat personnel, rotor damage from storm debris, hard landing imminent on your pad. Say again, hard landing? The transmission cut out. Priya looked at Nora. Nora was already turning back toward the ER. She walked fast, not running. Running in a hospital at 5 a.m. during a storm with no power causes a specific kind of secondary chaos she didn't want to start. And she pushed through the ER doors and said, without preamble, to the room, helicopter inbound, hard landing, 6 critical military personnel. Fitch looked up from the monitor he was watching. Source? Helipad frequency, Condor 7-2. They called themselves inbound a minute ago, and then the transmission broke. Fitch moved immediately to the radio panel. Pruitt was still in the bay. He looked at Nora. Then he looked at the trauma bays, 2 of them, which meant space for 2 patients at maximum with full setup, and they were already using one for the mechanic. He looked at the supply bag she'd brought in that he'd made her leave, which was now sitting on the counter where she'd set it, and which contained material for approximately 3 critical trauma cases. 6 critical patients. 2 bays. Battery reserves that had been running for 48 minutes and had maybe 40 left. And outside, a Category 3 hurricane that was not done. Pruitt's voice, when he spoke, was still controlled. But something underneath it had changed in a way she'd never heard before. Callahan, he said. She looked at him. Let's see what you can actually do. She didn't answer. She picked up the bag. And she heard the sound. The wrong, grinding sound of rotor blades that weren't turning the way they should, coming down fast out of a screaming sky. And she was already running. The helipad was on the roof of the east wing, and the stairwell door that accessed it had a magnetic lock that ran on primary power. Primary power was gone. Nora hit the door at full stride, and it didn't open. She grabbed the manual release bar mounted beside it, a red-painted lever that most of the staff didn't know existed because it was behind a signage panel that someone had pushed flush against the wall sometime in the past 2 years, yanked it down, and felt the lock disengage with a heavy mechanical clunk. She pushed through into the stairwell and took the stairs 2 at a time, the trauma bag swinging against her hip, the sound from the roof getting louder with every landing she cleared. The rotor noise was wrong in a way that was hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. It had a stuttering, arrhythmic quality, like something was catching and releasing in a cycle it wasn't designed for. She'd heard that sound once before, in a context she didn't think about if she could help it, and she knew what it meant. Whoever was flying that bird was managing a partial failure and buying seconds, not minutes. She shouldered through the roof access door and the hurricane hit her like a wall. The wind was sustained and massive, the kind that doesn't gust so much as press. A a constant lateral force that wanted to move her sideways no matter how she planted her feet. Rain was coming in nearly horizontal sheets. The floodlights that normally illuminated the helipad were dead with everything else, and for a moment she was navigating by nothing except the strobing anti-collision lights of the descending aircraft, red and white flashes cutting through the storm in an irregular pattern that told her the bird was rolling slightly on its axis in a way it absolutely should not have been. It came down fast, too fast. The left skid hit the pad first and hard, and the impact transmitted through the airframe in a visible shudder, and then the right skid came down at an angle that was wrong enough to make her breath catch. But it held, both skids held, and the rotors began their wind-down cycle, and the aircraft stayed on the pad and didn't roll, and that was the first thing that had gone right in the past 10 minutes. She was already moving toward it. The side door slid open before she reached the aircraft, shoved from inside by someone who looked like he was operating on will alone. He was in tactical gear, no helmet, a compression bandage wrapped around his left forearm that was dark with blood through 3 layers of dressing. He got the door open and then sat down heavily in the opening and looked at her with the particular flat-eyed assessment of someone who has been trained to evaluate a situation very quickly and is doing exactly that right now. "Medical?" he said. "Yes. How many?" 6 total. Pilot's ambulatory. The rest are not. He reached back into the cabin without looking and found a handhold to pull himself back in. "Come up." She grabbed the door frame and pulled herself into the cabin. The interior was dark except for the instrument glow from the cockpit, and it took her eyes 2 full seconds to adjust. 2 seconds she spent using her hands, finding a wrist, checking a pulse, registering temperature, the automatic physical inventory that doesn't require vision. 6 bodies in a space designed for 8, 4 of them in the rear bay, 2 in forward seats, all of them in tactical gear at varying stages of what she was starting to recognize as blast and ballistic injuries. The smell in the cabin was copper and sweat, and the specific chemical sharpness of expended ordnance, which told her these men had not been injured in the storm. They'd been injured before the storm caught them. "What happened?" she said, not because it changed the immediate priorities, but because it told her what to look for. The man who'd opened the door, she could see him now, mid-30s, a jaw that looked like it had been introduced to something hard at some point in the recent past, said, "Ambush, 40 minutes outside of station. We were extracting when the storm accelerated. Pilot made the call to push for Merrick." 40 minutes ago? Approximately. She was already at the first man in the rear bay. Unconscious, breathing, but the breathing was wrong, shallow, asymmetrical, the right side of his chest moving less than the left. She ran her hands along his rib cage and felt the crepitus before she found the wound, a penetrating injury below the 5th rib, right side, sealed with a field dressing that had been correctly applied but was now soaked through and showing signs of tension. She pulled the decompression needle from the kit in her bag, 14 gauge, she went by feel in the dark, found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it in. The hiss of releasing pressure was audible even over the wind noise from the open door. The man's next breath was fuller. She moved. Second patient, airway partially compromised, tongue position and jaw anatomy working against him in the unconscious state. Classic supine obstruction. She performed a jaw thrust with one hand and reached for the nasopharyngeal airway in her kit with the other. Sized it by feel against the distance from his nostril to his earlobe, lubricated it from the small tube she kept in the side pocket of the bag, and placed it in a single motion that she didn't have to think about. He started breathing better. She moved. Third patient was the one who scared her. He was conscious, which was the only thing that made him less immediately critical than the first 2. Consciousness meant a functioning brainstem, meant he was compensating somehow. But his compensation was costing him. His face was the color of old concrete, and he was breathing in the rapid, shallow pattern of someone whose body had decided that moving less volume faster was better than moving more volume slowly, which meant hypovolemia, which meant internal bleeding somewhere she couldn't see in the dark with the tools she had. He looked at her when she reached him. "Hey," he said. His voice was surprisingly steady for someone who looked the way he looked. "Hey," she said. "I need to look at your abdomen. Tell me if this hurts." "Everything hurts." "Fair. Tell me if this hurts more." She palpated his abdomen through the tactical vest, felt the rigidity in the left upper quadrant that she'd been afraid she was going to feel, and said, "Okay, you've got internal bleeding. I need to get you downstairs." "How bad?" She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to lie to you. It's bad enough that we need to move right now." Something in his expression did a complicated thing. Not fear exactly, more like a man doing rapid math on a problem he already knew the answer to and didn't like. "Okay," he said. She moved. The remaining three were in varying states. One conscious with a ballistic wound to the lower leg that had been tourniquet-controlled in the field. One unconscious but with a strong pulse and no obvious immediate threat to airway or breathing. And the pilot, who was indeed ambulatory and had a laceration across the top of his scalp that had bled extensively in the way scalp lacerations do, and who was currently gripping the back of the co-pilot seat with both hands and staring at the instrument panel as if he was trying to will it back to life. "Sir," she said. He turned. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then I need you walking down those stairs in about 90 seconds. Can you do that?" "Where are we going?" "Emergency department, 2nd floor. You'll find it." The patient with the abdominal injury. "I'm handling him. Move." He moved. She was back at the door of the aircraft before she registered that she'd given orders to an officer without a second of hesitation, and he'd followed them without a second of question, and neither of them had noticed that anything unusual had happened. Getting 6 critical patients off a rooftop in a Category 3 hurricane with no power and no gurney elevator access was the kind of problem that didn't have a clean solution, which meant she was going to have to find an ugly one and make it work. She found Dr. Fitch at the top of the stairwell. He had followed her up, a decision that reflected either excellent judgment or exactly the kind of impulsive helpfulness that was going to get someone killed if she didn't direct it immediately. "Fitch," she said, "go back down and get me people. Anyone who can walk and carry. Nurses, aides, orderlies, I don't care. And I need gurneys at the base of the stairs. The emergency stairwell can't take a gurney, but we can carry to the landing and transfer." "How many critical?" "All of them, but some more than others. I have 2 I need down in the next 5 minutes and 4 more in the next 15. The one with the abdominal bleed goes first." Fitch looked at her for one beat, the look of a man recalibrating something. And then he turned and went down the stairs at a pace that was almost running. She went back into the aircraft. The man with the abdominal injury was still conscious. She'd given him that much credit. He was still working to stay with her, eyes tracking, responding when she spoke. She got her arm under his, and he took as much of his own weight as he could manage, which was some of it, which was more than she'd expected. "What's your name?" she asked as they moved toward the door. "Garrison," he said. "Eli Garrison." "Okay, Eli, 3 steps down to the pad, and then we're going to walk about 40 feet in a very unpleasant wind. I need you to keep moving." "I can keep moving." He said it with more conviction than his vital signs warranted, but she wasn't going to argue with conviction right now. She got him to the door, helped him down, and then they were on the pad with the hurricane doing everything it could to make the next 40 feet the hardest. 40 feet either of them had ever walked. He stayed upright. She stayed with him. Yes. Pruitt was in the emergency department when she came through the stairwell door with Garrison. He had mobilized some of the staff in the time she'd been on the roof. 3 nurses were in the bay. Someone had found additional flashlights, and the 2 stretchers that had been in storage were now positioned in the main corridor. It was more than she'd expected from him, and she registered that honestly, even as she registered the look on his face when he saw her coming through the door with a patient who clearly needed more intervention than a floor 4 nurse was supposed to provide. He didn't say anything immediately. She got Garrison onto the stretcher and began a rapid secondary assessment, narrating findings for the closest nurse, a woman named Sandra who had been in the ER for 6 years and needed very little direction. Abdominal rigid, left upper quadrant, probable splenic or hepatic origin. Pressure's compensating, but he's burning through it. I need 2 large bore IVs, O negative if we have it, and I need the portable ultrasound from the bag I brought in. She looked up. Sandra, where's the bag? Sandra pointed. It was on the counter where she'd left it. Pruitt had not moved it a second time. She got the ultrasound. She placed the probe below Garrison's left coastal margin and found what she was looking for in the first sweep. Free fluid, a significant collection. moving with respiration in the way that free fluid moves when there's enough of it to slosh. "He needs surgery," she said, mostly to herself, which was the particular frustration of being the person who can see the problem when you're not the person who can fix it. "Surgical suite is on backup battery," Sandra said. "Dr. Adler went up 20 minutes ago to assess." "But can we do a damage control procedure?" Sandra looked at her. "We're an emergency department." "I know what we are. Can we do it?" That's above my pay grade to answer. It was above Nora's pay grade to answer too, technically. She looked at Garrison, who was looking at her with that same flat-eyed steadiness he'd maintained since the helicopter, and she thought about what she had in the bag and what the suite upstairs had, and whether the math worked. It didn't work cleanly. It might work enough. "I need to talk to Adler," she said. She turned and found Pruitt directly behind her. He had been watching. She hadn't noticed him moving, which meant she'd been focused enough on the patient that she'd lost peripheral awareness, which was not a thing that happened to her often and which told her something about the situation's intensity. "Who authorized you to be in this bay?" he said. She looked at him. Then she looked at Garrison. Then she looked back at Pruitt. "I brought him in," she said. "That doesn't authorize you." "Randall," Fitch's voice from the second bay. "I have 2 more coming in right now, and I need her." Pruitt turned toward Fitch, turned back toward Nora. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was trying to decide which version of himself to be in the next 30 seconds. The administrator, or the man who understood on some level that the situation had moved past administrative categories. "You work under my authority," he said, finally. "Understood?" "I understand," she said, which was not the same as agreeing, but it was what she said. She went to Bay 2. No. The next 45 minutes were the most technically demanding of her 3 years at Merrick. She moved between bays and the corridor space they'd cleared to function as overflow, working with whoever was available, adapting when what she needed wasn't there. The man with the tension pneumothorax from the helicopter, the one she'd needled on the roof, needed a chest tube, and she walked Sandra through the setup while she performed the procedure herself. The 2 of them working in near silence, punctuated by the specific language of clinical need. Instrument names, confirmation requests, vital signs called out and acknowledged. The airway obstruction patient was the other immediate priority. She'd managed him on the roof with the nasopharyngeal airway, but his level of consciousness was declining in a way that made her concerned the basic adjunct wasn't going to be sufficient for much longer. She did a jaw thrust assessment, checked his gag reflex, present but diminishing, and made the call. "I need to intubate," she said. Fitch was beside her. He'd been functioning as her hands on 2 patients simultaneously, which meant he'd been operating at the edge of his comfort zone for the past half hour and had done it without complaint. "I can," he started. "I've got it. I need you at his head for cricoid pressure, and I need someone calling SAT every 30 seconds. She pulled the laryngoscope from the bag. The blade had its own battery. She checked the light, solid, good, and positioned herself. Visualized the chords on the first pass. Tube in. Confirmed with the bag. Confirmed with the portable capnograph she'd included in her pre-storm cache specifically because she'd read the supply inventory and knew the ER's primary capnograph was due for calibration and might not be reliable. The patient's SAT, which had been drifting toward the low 80s, began climbing within 90 seconds. She secured the tube, handed the bag ventilation to the aide who'd been standing at the doorway not knowing what to do, gave the aide a rate and told him to count out loud, and moved. Pruitt found her in the corridor between Bay 2 and the overflow space at the 40-minute mark. He had been moving through the department the entire time. She'd been aware of him at the edge of her vision, watching, not interfering after the initial confrontation, which was a kind of restraint she hadn't expected from him. But he was doing something she recognized now that she looked directly at him. He was documenting. He had a tablet in his hand and he was making notes. "What are you writing?" she said. She had a brief gap between patients, 30 seconds, maybe less. "Observations," he said. "About what?" "Staff conduct." He said it without inflection. "Procedure compliance. Authorization status." She understood then what he was building, and the understanding was cold and clear. He was writing an incident report. He was documenting her actions in the emergency bay as unauthorized procedure violations. He was covering himself by creating a record that positioned her involvement not as the thing that had kept these men alive, but as the thing that had put the hospital at risk. "Randall," she said, and her voice was quieter than she'd meant it to be. "There are 6 men alive right now who came off that roof. I'm aware of the patient census. 3 of them would not be alive if— I'm going to need you to let me do my job," he said. She looked at the tablet in his hands. She thought about the maintenance logs she still had. She thought about the tabletop drill results she'd saved. She thought about every report she'd filed and every conversation she'd had in his office, and every time the room had gone quiet when she walked in. She thought about how it felt to have Eli Garrison look at her with steady eyes and say, "I can keep moving," when his blood pressure had been falling, and he'd known it and kept moving anyway. "Okay," she said. She went back to her patients. It was a little after 6:30 in the morning when the man in Bay 2 opened his eyes, focused, and looked directly at her. He was the one she'd given the nasopharyngeal airway on the roof, the one she'd then intubated in the bay, who was now breathing with mechanical support but whose eyes were tracking with the coherent attention of someone whose brain was getting adequate perfusion. His color was better, his pressure was better. His name, she'd learned from the dog tags Fitch had carefully removed and set on the edge of the supply cart, was T. Harwick. He looked at her for a long moment. She was working on charting. She'd been keeping handwritten notes throughout because the electronic system was down, small slips of paper she tucked into her pocket so they didn't get separated from the patients they described. His eyes moved across her face, down to her badge, back to her face. His expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, in the way that things are subtle when someone is intubated and can't speak and is working with what they have. But the change was there, and it was unambiguous, and it did something to the shape of his face that made him look for a moment not like a critical patient, but like a person encountering something unexpected. He raised his right hand, slowly, with the deliberate effort of someone managing an IV line and the weight of his own arm, and he reached toward her. She caught his hand, thinking he was trying to reach the tube, trying to self-extubate, the most common purposeful movement in an intubated patient coming out of sedation. But he wasn't reaching for the tube. He was reaching for her badge. He turned it so the face of it caught the flashlight beam from the clip light above the bay. He read it, and then his hand dropped, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen in 3 years, an expression she associated with a different place and a different version of herself, and he closed his eyes again. She stood very still for a moment. Then she took her badge back, gently, and tucked it back against her chest, and went back to her notes. On the other side of the department, she heard Pruitt's voice, talking quietly into his phone. The cell towers were out, but the hospital had a satellite line for emergencies. He was talking to someone, and she couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could hear his tone, which was the tone of a man managing a situation, which was different from the tone of a man responding to a crisis. She made a note on her slip of paper. She put it in her pocket. She looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds, which was something she'd learned to do in a different life when the weight of a situation needed somewhere to go that wasn't her hands. Then she went to check on Eli Garrison. Garrison was in the corridor stretcher, the IV fluids running, his color not good but not worse than it had been, which was the best she could say for him. He was conscious, which continued to impress her. "Surgery?" he said when she reached him. "Dr. Adler is assessing the suite. We're working on it." "Working on it." He repeated it without sarcasm, which was somehow worse than if he'd been sarcastic about it. "You're compensating," she said. "Your pressure has been holding for the last 20 minutes. Is that good? It means your body is doing its job. I need you to let it keep doing its job and not fight me on anything I ask you to do." "I'm not fighting you. You were trying to sit up 10 minutes ago." "I wanted to see what was happening." "Now you know what's happening," she said. "You're lying on a stretcher in a hurricane-damaged hospital, getting the best care we can give you with what we have, and I need you to stay down." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not a regular nurse, are you?" She checked his IV site, confirmed the flow rate, and didn't answer. "I've been in a lot of medical facilities," he said. "I know how medical people move. You don't move like someone who works on a floor." I work wherever they need me, she said. That's not what I said. She met his eyes. He had the direct gaze of someone who asked questions because he actually wanted answers, not because he was performing curiosity. Get some rest, Eli, she said. She moved on before he could ask anything else. The surgical suite assessment came back at 7:15. Dr. Adler, the hospital's general surgeon, came down from the second floor looking like a man who had been awake for 22 hours and was running on bad coffee and the professional obligation not to fall apart in front of his colleagues. He found Nora beside the corridor stretcher and said, without preamble, I can do a damage control laparotomy. Battery reserves are sufficient for the suite lights and suction. Anesthesia has manual backup for the vent, but I need someone who can scrub in. I can scrub in, she said. Adler looked at her. The look lasted about 2 seconds. Emergency department trained? Trained for more than that, she said. But yes. He opened his mouth, closed it, made the calculation that experienced surgeons make when they're short-staffed and the clock is running on a patient with free fluid in his abdomen, and said, Okay, 10 minutes. She went to scrub. She was halfway down the corridor toward the scrub sink when she heard Pruitt's voice behind her. Callahan. She stopped, turned. He was standing at the entrance to the bay, tablet in hand, and his face had an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something between calculation and something else. Something that might have been the first early stages of understanding that the situation was no longer what he'd thought it was when he'd walked in at 5 a.m. You're not cleared for surgical assist, he said. I'm aware of my credentials, she said. Then, Dr. Adler asked me. Eli Garrison needs surgery in the next hour. The battery reserves won't last much past 9. She looked at him steadily. Tell me what you want me to do, Randall. He held the tablet. She waited. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the storm, which had not diminished, and the sounds of the department, which had found a rhythm in the past hour, and underneath all of it, the particular quality of silence that exists inside a building full of people waiting to see what happens next. Pruitt said nothing. She turned and walked toward the scrub sink. She heard him, behind her, pick up the satellite phone again. And for the first time since the helicopter had hit the pad, she felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not fear, but the particular clarity of a situation that has been heading somewhere for a long time and has finally, irreversibly, arrived. She didn't know yet what he was saying into that phone. She would find out. She scrubbed her hands at the sink, watching the water run, counting the seconds the way she'd been taught, and above her the hurricane pressed against the building with everything it had. And somewhere on the floor behind her, T. Harwick was lying in a bay with a tube down his throat, and a recognition in his eyes that he hadn't finished communicating yet. She rinsed. She dried. She pushed through the door to the surgical suite and didn't look back. The surgical suite on the second floor was cold, the way operating rooms are always cold, a deliberate institutional chill that exists to slow bacterial growth and keep surgeons alert through the long procedures. And it hit her when she pushed through the door the same way it always had, the same way it had in a dozen different facilities over a decade of work she'd tried to leave behind her. She didn't let herself think about that. Adler was already at the table, gowned and gloved, the scrub tech, a young man named Rourke, who looked like he was managing his own fear by focusing very hard on the instrument tray, positioned to his right. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Patel, had Garrison intubated and draped and was watching the manual ventilation bag with the focused attention of someone who has decided that counting breaths is the only thing that exists in the world right now. Garrison's abdomen was prepped and draped. The battery-powered surgical lights were casting a clean, slightly blue-white field over the operative site. And in that light, Garrison looked very pale and very still, and the monitors showed a pressure that had held but was not holding with any confidence. The numbers sitting at the low edge of acceptable and not climbing. Ready? Adler said. Ready, she said. She took her position across from him, and Rourke passed her the first instrument without being asked, because she had positioned herself correctly and extended her hand at the right angle, and he was good at his job even if his hands weren't entirely steady. Adler made the incision. What followed was not elegant. Damage control surgery is not designed to be elegant. It's designed to stop the dying, to get a patient stable enough to survive the transport to definitive care, to close the hemorrhage without trying to fix everything, because trying to fix everything kills people. Adler knew this, and she knew this, and they worked with the particular economy of two people who understand that speed and precision are not opposites when the situation demands both. The source was the spleen, partially lacerated, bleeding at a rate that explained Garrison's numbers over the past hour. Adler worked the clamps while she managed retraction and suction, keeping the field clear with a focus that required her to stop thinking about anything outside the operative site. Not the storm, not Pruitt's phone call, not the department below them where 5 other men were in various states of acute need, just the field, just the next move. Rourke passed instruments and called counts and kept pace without being prompted, and at one point Adler said quietly, "Good," which was not directed at her specifically, but landed anyway, and she didn't acknowledge it because the time for acknowledgement was after the bleeding stopped. It took 31 minutes to achieve hemorrhage control. Not a record, not smooth. There was a moment around the 14-minute mark where the clamp placement was wrong, and she said so, and Adler repositioned without discussion. And there was a moment around 22 minutes where Patel said pressure dropping in a tone that meant do something now, and Adler moved faster, and the pressure stabilized. And those were the moments that would matter if anyone ever asked her how it went, because that's what surgery actually is. A series of problems met with adjustments, not a performance. When Adler stepped back from the packing and said, "Okay," she exhaled slowly through her nose and checked her hands without thinking about it. The automatic post-procedure check, gloves intact, nothing wrong. "He needs a trauma center," Adler said. "I know. When the storm clears, first transport out." "Agreed." She began the assist on closure while Adler dictated to Rourke, and the whole room settled into the quieter work of finishing, and it was in that settling that she became aware for the first time in over an hour of the sounds from outside the suite. Voices in the corridor, multiple voices. Not the organized sound of clinical work, something with a different texture, something that had the quality of a situation developing. She heard Pruitt's voice distinct from the others, and then another voice she didn't recognize, deeper, with a cadence that wasn't hospital cadence. She kept working. "Boss." The closure took 12 minutes. She stripped her gloves, stepped back from the table, gave Rourke her gown, and went to the door. The corridor outside the surgical suite had 4 people in it. Pruitt was one of them. The other 3 were in military working uniforms, not the tactical gear of the men she'd pulled off the helicopter, but the administrative operational dress of people who work commands, not field work. One of them was a woman in her 40s with the posture of someone who has spent significant time ensuring other people follow procedures, and she had a tablet in her hand and was looking at it with an expression that suggested whatever she was reading had not improved her morning. They all looked up when Nora came through the door. Pruitt's expression did the complex rearrangement she'd learned to read as recalibration. The woman with the tablet said, "Are you Nora Callahan?" "Yes." "Commander Lena Marsh, Naval Station Medical Affairs." She said it the way people say things that are meant to establish immediate hierarchical context. "I need to speak with you. I have patients in the department below. I'm aware. I also need to speak with you." A pause that was not quite a concession. Briefly, and here. Nora looked at Pruitt. He was watching Commander Marsh in a way that she couldn't quite read. Not the watching of a man who has set something in motion and is satisfied with it, but the watching of a man who has set something in motion and is no longer certain where it's going. "Okay," Nora said. "Director Pruitt contacted my office 45 minutes ago regarding unauthorized medical procedures performed by non-credentialed staff during the emergency event. Also, Marsh's delivery was precise, each clause placed like something being set on a scale. He's requested a formal review of actions taken in the emergency department tonight." Nora said nothing. "As part of that review, I need to understand your qualifications for the procedures you performed, specifically the needle decompression, the intubation, and the surgical assist. Those procedures were performed at the request of the attending physicians present," Nora said. "Dr. Fitch requested my assistance in the emergency department. Dr. Adler requested the surgical assist." "That's accurate," Adler said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come through the door. Marsh looked at Adler. Dr. Adler. Commander? He pulled off his surgical cap, which had the effect of making him look simultaneously more disheveled and more authoritative. I requested Nurse Callahan's assistance because I needed someone who could perform at that level, and she was the only one available. I stand by that decision. The issue Director Pruitt has raised is whether Nurse Callahan's civilian nursing credentials cover the scope of what she performed. They don't, Nora said. Everyone in the corridor looked at her. My civilian nursing credentials don't cover the scope of what I performed tonight, she said. That's correct. The silence had a specific weight. Then on what basis? Marsh started. On the basis of prior training and qualifications that aren't reflected in my current employment record. Nora kept her voice even. My civilian credentials are accurate for my civilian position. They're not the complete picture of my training. Marsh's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted in the way that postures shift when a conversation has moved somewhere unexpected. What's the complete picture? Nora looked at Pruitt. He was watching her now with something she hadn't seen on his face in 3 years of working under him. Not the administrative calculation she'd come to expect, but something closer to genuine uncertainty, which on his face looked almost like discomfort. I think that conversation needs to happen with someone else present, Nora said. Such as? Whoever came in with those 6 men on the helicopter. The man who had opened the helicopter door, the one who'd assessed her with flat, efficient eyes and let her in, was in Bay 3 when she came back down to the department. He'd been sutured, his forearm wound properly dressed, and he was sitting up on the edge of the stretcher with the kind of controlled stillness that some people develop when they've spent a long time in environments where movement had to be deliberate. His name, she'd learned from the patient intake notes Sandra had managed to keep running in the chaos, was Senior Chief Marcus Okafor. He looked at her when she walked in. Surgery went well? He said. Garrison is stable. He needs a trauma center when transport's available. Understood. A pause. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. She treated it like one anyway. I've worked in high-pressure environments, she said. That's a careful answer. It's the answer I have right now. She pulled the stool from the corner and sat down, which put her at eye level with him, which she'd done deliberately. There are people upstairs who want to know about my qualifications. I need to understand something before I have that conversation. Okay. The man in Bay 2. Harwick. When he looked at my badge earlier, she stopped, organized the sentence. He recognized something. I need to know what he recognized. Okafor looked at her for a long moment, not assessing her this time. He'd finished assessing her somewhere around the 30-minute mark of watching her work, she suspected, but deciding something. Where were you in 2019, Papas? He said. The question landed with specific gravity. Working, she said. That's also a careful answer. Yes. He nodded slowly. Harwick was in the Caramon extraction, 2019. He was the one with the sucking chest wound that the forward surgical team said was non-survivable. He paused. The medical officer who stabilized him and got him to evac was a Navy lieutenant commander who everyone in that unit has been trying to find for the past 3 years because she rotated out and the records got complicated, and nobody could track where she went afterward. Nora sat very still. The call sign, she said quietly. What was the call sign? Calloway, he said. The word sat between them. She hadn't heard that name in 3 years. She'd walked away from it deliberately, the same way you walk away from a room where something terrible happened. Not because you're a coward, but because you need to be somewhere else for a while. Need to be someone who isn't carrying the specific weight of that room. I'm not that person anymore, she said. You were pretty much exactly that person about 40 minutes ago, Okafor said. She opened her mouth, closed it. He said it without heat, without challenge, just the flat accuracy of someone who had watched her work and drawn the obvious conclusion. There are 6 of my people alive because of what you did tonight, he said. 3 of them because of decisions you made in the first 15 minutes that nobody else in this building would have known to make. He looked at her steadily. Whatever you're calling yourself now, that's what you are. She stood up. There's a commander from medical affairs upstairs who wants to talk about my credentials, she said. I'm going to need the record of my prior service to be accessible to her. I can make a call, Okafor said. I'd appreciate that. She turned to go. Callahan, he said. She looked back. The man in Bay 2. He's been awake for the past 20 minutes. He's been asking for you. Harwick had been extubated. The respiratory drive had come back strong and Fitch had made the call, and Harwick was now breathing on his own, supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula, and his color was coming back in the way that color comes back when the body decides it's going to keep going. He watched her come through the bay curtain. She pulled the stool and sat. Hey, she said. Hey. His voice was rough from the tube, the particular texture of post-extubation speech. He cleared his throat. You're Calloway. I used to be. You stabilized my chest in a ditch outside Caraman with a piece of a water bottle and a valve from somebody's gear bag. I remember. I spent 3 years thinking that was a thing I dreamed, he said, because the record said the medical officer on that rotation was reassigned and nobody could say where. I transferred out, civilian medicine. He looked at her the way people look at something they're trying to reconcile with what they thought they knew. Why? She had prepared over 3 years a version of this answer that was honest but not complete. She used the not complete version most of the time because the complete version required more than a casual conversation could hold. But Harwick wasn't asking casually. He'd had a tube down his throat an hour ago, and he was asking with the specific directness of someone who's been close enough to the end to have stopped caring about conversational comfort. I lost someone on a mission 18 months after Caraman, she said. A corpsman who was under my supervision. We made the wrong call on a triage decision, and he didn't make it out. She kept her voice even, which was not the same as the words not costing her anything. I decided I wasn't fit to be in command of those decisions anymore. So you came here. So I came here. And spent 3 years warning them about generator failures and protocol gaps. She looked at him. How do you know about that? Okafor's been talking to people in the department while you were in surgery. A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He's thorough. She thought about what Okafor had been doing for the past hour while she'd been in the suite, and the picture it formed was the picture of a man who had been quiet and observant and was building a complete understanding of the situation, which was exactly what someone in his role should do and was not a comfortable thing for her to think about right now. What happens next? Harwick asked. You recover, she said. You get transported to a trauma center when the storm clears. You get the follow-up care you need. That's not what I'm asking. She knew it wasn't. I don't know yet, she said, which was the honest answer. But upstairs, things were moving. She found out through Sandra, who had the particular gift of knowing what was happening in every corner of a building without appearing to seek the information, that Okafor had placed 2 calls on the hospital's satellite line. The first had been to the Naval Station Command Duty Officer. The second had been to a number that Sandra described only as someone higher up, which was the kind of description that told Nora everything she needed to know about the second call without telling her anything specific. Marsh was still on the second floor and she was no longer alone. A second uniform had arrived, a man this time, with the insignia of a medical corps or officer, and the expression of someone who had driven through a hurricane to be somewhere and was not happy about it but was going to do the thing that needed doing. Pruitt was with them. She learned this from Fitch, who came to find her in the corridor at 8:15, when the storm outside was still going, but with slightly less of the sustained assault that had characterized the worst hours, the particular quality of a storm beginning to exhaust itself, though it had a long way to go yet. What's happening upstairs? She asked. Fitch looked like a man who had been awake for 20 hours and had run a significant portion of those hours at a pace he wasn't accustomed to, and the fatigue was showing in the way fatigue shows. Around the eyes, in the slight imprecision of his movements, in the fact that he was holding his coffee cup without drinking from it. I'm not entirely sure, he said. Marsh has been on the phone. The medical corps officer, his name is Denton, Captain Denton, has been reviewing records. Pruitt has been in this room and has been progressively quieter as the morning goes on. What records? Hospital records, equipment maintenance logs, Emergency protocol documentation. Fitch paused. And something from the station's personnel database. I didn't see what. She stood with that for a moment. Are you okay? Fitch asked. The question surprised her because it was a human question rather than a clinical question, and she hadn't been expecting it. I'm functional, she said. That's what I thought. He finally drank from the coffee cup. For what it's worth, what you did tonight. I've been doing emergency medicine for 11 years, and I've never seen anyone work like that without stopping to think about whether they could. I knew I could. I know you did. That's what I mean. He looked at her with the plain, tired honesty of someone who has moved past the point of professional carefulness. I've been watching you for a year and a half. I knew you were good. I didn't know what you actually were. She didn't have a response to that. He nodded, as if she'd said something, and went back toward the bay. The moment of rupture happened at 9:47. She was in the corridor doing med reconciliation on her handwritten patient notes, trying to create a coherent record from the slips of paper she'd been keeping, because whenever the electronic system came back online, someone was going to need to reconstruct the timeline. When she heard Pruitt's voice from the stairwell, he was coming down. She stayed where she was. He came through the stairwell door and stopped when he saw her. He was carrying his tablet, and his expression had completed some kind of transition. She couldn't say exactly what it had transitioned from or to, only that it was different from any version of his face she'd seen in 3 years of working under him. Callahan, he said. Director. He looked at her for a moment that stretched past professional length into something she didn't have a category for. Then he said, Why didn't you tell anyone? It wasn't quite a question. It had the intonation of a statement that is waiting to be answered. Because it wasn't relevant to my job here, she said. It was relevant to every conversation we've had about protocol, and no, she said, it wasn't. What I did before has no bearing on whether the backup generator needed to be tested or whether the mass casualty protocol was functional. Those were valid concerns regardless of my background. I'm not arguing that. What are you arguing? He didn't answer. She watched his jaw move slightly and then stop. The maintenance logs you have, he said finally, the ones from February. What about them? Did you give them to anyone upstairs? Not yet, she said. Something crossed his face. Not relief, because the situation was too far past relief, but maybe the first clear-eyed acknowledgement of a reality he had been managing around for months. Pruitt, she said, whatever's happening upstairs, I didn't set it in motion. Okafor made calls because his men are in this hospital, and he needed to understand the situation. That's not something I engineered. I know, he said. It was the first time in 3 years he'd said those 2 words to her without a qualifier attached. She didn't say anything. He turned and went back toward his office, and she watched him go, and there was no satisfaction in it, which was the thing she'd learned about being right over a long period of time. That it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a weight you've been carrying finally setting down, which is not the same as not being tired. 16. At 10:20, Captain Denton came down from the 2nd floor. He was a compact man with gray at his temples, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing at attention until it becomes involuntary, and he walked into the emergency department with the measured pace of someone who has identified a destination and is proceeding to it. He found her at the supply station and said, Nurse Callahan, I need a few minutes. She followed him to the small consultation room off the corridor, the room that was usually used for patient-family conversations, with its 2 chairs and its box of tissues and its terrible lighting that was slightly less terrible on battery backup than the fluorescents had been. He sat. She sat across from him. I've been reviewing records for the past 2 hours, he said. Naval personnel records, hospital records, equipment maintenance documentation. He set his tablet on the table between them, face down. I want to ask you something directly. Okay. The safety concerns you raised about this facility, the generator, the emergency protocols, the supply inadequacies, those were raised formally, in writing? Yes. 6 separate written reports over 18 months submitted to Director Pruitt. I have copies. And the response to those reports? Verbal acknowledgement. No documented action taken on any of them. The tabletop drill failure in March of last year? She looked at him. How do you know about that? Nurse Marsh found a copy of the raw results in the facility's administrative shared drive. The summary submitted to Station Command showed a passing score. He kept his eyes on her. The raw results show a failing score, significantly failing. The room was quiet. She had known about the discrepancy. She had suspected it, specifically because the passing summary had appeared 2 weeks after the drill, and she'd been at the drill, and she knew what the results had actually been. But she hadn't been able to prove the substitution. She'd only had the raw results, not the summary that was sent upward, and she couldn't prove they were different without access to both. Apparently someone had found both. I was at the drill, she said. I have the raw results. I know, Denton said. Your copy has already been referenced. I need to formally inform you that the documentation discrepancy you flagged, the difference between what was reported to command and what actually occurred, is being reviewed at a level above this facility. She absorbed that. What does that mean for Director Pruitt? She asked. I can't speak to that at this stage. What does it mean for me? He looked at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who is trying to be precise. Nurse Callahan, I've been in naval medicine for 21 years. What I know is that 6 special operations personnel are alive in this facility because of actions taken tonight that went beyond the nominal scope of your current position. He paused. I also know that your prior service record has been accessed by my office this morning and that there are people above my rank who are aware of your presence here and the events of the past several hours. She kept her breathing even. What I can tell you, he continued, is that the conversation that began this morning as a complaint filed by Director Pruitt has become something significantly different. Different how? He reached for his tablet. He turned it over and slid it across the table toward her. She looked at the screen. It was an authorization record. Official header, Naval Medical Command. And at the bottom, a name she recognized. A name she hadn't heard spoken in 3 years. The name of a medical corps admiral she had reported to in a different life, and whose digital signature was at the bottom of a document she read twice before she fully understood what she was looking at. She set the tablet down. I need to speak with Okafor, she said. He's waiting for you, Denton said. One more thing. She looked up. The man who filed the complaint this morning, Director Pruitt. Denton's voice was careful. While my office has been reviewing facility records, we identified that he accessed and modified the emergency readiness documentation storage system at 2:14 this morning during the active emergency event. She was very still. The access log showed deletion activity, Denton said, specifically deletion of maintenance records from the generator service file. Something cold settled through her. She thought about Pruitt with his tablet. She thought about his voice on the satellite phone. She thought about him saying leave the bag when she'd been ready to help, and about the men who had been on the roof of this building bleeding while he managed the optics of what was happening. He deleted the records, she said, while the patients were in the department. The access log timestamps correlate with the period when he was present in the emergency department and you were actively managing patients. Denton met her eyes. They also correlate with the satellite phone call he made to my office, the call that initiated the complaint against you. The room was very quiet. She thought about Eli Garrison asking how bad with steady eyes. She thought about Harwick reaching for her badge in the dark. She thought about Okafor saying you were pretty much exactly that person, about 40 minutes ago with the flat certainty of someone who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. She thought about 3 years of reports that went nowhere, and meetings that went badly, and lunches eaten alone, and the very particular exhaustion of being right about something for a long time in a place that has decided you're wrong. Where is Pruitt now? She asked. He's in his office, Denton said, with Commander Marsh. She stood up. What's in the authorization document? She said. Denton looked at her. It reinstates your prior credentials, effective immediately, pending formal processing. It also authorizes Naval Medical Command's investigative office to conduct a full review of this facility's emergency readiness documentation. She nodded. There's one more thing on the document, he said. Page 2. She hadn't turned to page 2. She picked up the tablet. Page 2 had a single paragraph, and the paragraph contained a name she had not spoken out loud in 3 years, and beneath it a title that she had last heard applied to herself in a different world, and below that, a request, signed by 3 people, one of whom was Okafor, and one of whom was Harwick, and one of whom was the admiral whose signature was on page 1, that she consider whether the work she had walked away from was work she might be ready to return to. She set the tablet down. She walked out of the consultation room. In the corridor, the department was settling into the particular post-crisis rhythm of a place where the acute phase has passed, but nothing is over. Patients needing reassessment, documentation needing to catch up with events, staff moving with the careful, conserving pace of people who have been running for hours and aren't ready to stop. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the storm was thinning. Not over, still dangerous, still loud, but the quality of the sky through the rain-streaked glass was changing. The absolute dark of the peak hours giving way to something that had the shape, if not yet the light, of morning. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her. She had not looked at herself clearly in 3 years. She'd caught herself in mirrors, in the dark of windows, in the reflective surfaces that exist everywhere in a hospital. But she'd learned to look past rather than at, which is a specific skill you develop when there's something you don't want to see. She looked now. Behind her reflection, she heard footsteps, and then she heard Okafor's voice say her name, not Callahan and not the call sign, but the name on page 2 of the document. She turned around, and Okafor was there, and behind him were 4 of the 6 men from the helicopter, the ones who could walk, who had found their way to the corridor in hospital gowns and bare feet, and the specific, stripped-down dignity of people who have decided that if they can stand up, they're going to stand up. And Harwick, who should not have been out of the bay, who was holding his IV pole with one hand and the doorframe with the other, was the last one through. And he looked at her with eyes that had been closed when she'd put the tube in, and were very open now. Okafor said, "There are some things that need to be said." And she heard, from somewhere behind her, the sound of Pruitt's office door opening. Pruitt stopped in the corridor doorway. He had his jacket on, which meant he'd been getting ready to go somewhere, or had dressed himself as a kind of armor for whatever he understood was coming, and he was holding a folder, the physical kind, the kind that people carry when they want to appear to have documentation on their side. He took in the scene in the corridor with a single sweep of his eyes. Okafor, the 4 men in hospital gowns, Harwick at the end holding his IV pole, Nora between them and him. His face did not fall apart. She would give him that. He was a man who had built a career on managing appearances, and even now, even with whatever had happened in the past hour in his office with Marsh, he held his expression with the practiced steadiness of someone who believes composure is its own argument. "This is a patient care area," he said. "These men should be in their bays." "They're ambulatory," Okafor said. "Ambulatory patients have the right to be in common areas. They're post-trauma patients, and they need to be resting." Director Pruitt. Okafor's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had shifted to the register of a man who has decided that the conversational portion of an encounter is finished. "My men are where they choose to be. I'd like to introduce you to someone." Pruitt looked at Nora. "We've met," Pruitt said. "I don't think you have," Okafor said. "Not properly." The corridor was quiet. Denton had come out of the consultation room and was standing to Nora's left, tablet in hand. Sandra was at the nurse's station pretending to chart, and not pretending very convincingly. Fitch had appeared at the entrance to Bay 2 with the specific stillness of a man who understands that what is happening is important and has decided to witness it. Okafor said, "The nurse who spent the last 5 hours keeping my people alive is Lieutenant Commander Nora Callahan, formerly of Naval Special Operations Medical Support, decorated twice for actions under fire, author of the forward surgical protocols currently in use by 3 SOCOM medical teams, and the officer my unit has been trying to locate for 3 years because she saved 7 of our people in Karaman and then disappeared into a civilian hospital where, as far as I can tell, she spent the better part of that time trying to prevent exactly the kind of emergency that happened here tonight." He paused. "And being ignored." Pruitt's jaw was doing the thing. "Her prior service doesn't change the fact that—" "What doesn't it change?" Okafor said. "Specifically." Silence. "The generator," Okafor said. "The drill results? The supply inadequacies she documented in 6 separate written reports?" He took one step forward, which put him closer to Pruitt without crowding him. The particular geometry of a man who understands how space and proximity communicate authority. Which of those reports was she wrong about, Director? Pruitt looked at his folder. He opened his mouth. He closed it. And in the space where his answer should have been, the corridor held its breath. It was Denton who moved the situation forward, because Denton was the kind of man who understood that witness silences have a limit past which they become counterproductive, and he had what needed to happen next clearly in mind. Director Pruitt, he said, I need you to come with me. Commander Marsh has additional questions regarding the access log activity from this morning. Pruitt looked at Denton. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of an outcome he had probably known was possible and had hoped to avoid. I have nothing to hide, Pruitt said. Then this will be brief, Denton said. He held the door to the consultation room. Pruitt looked at Nora one more time, a look she couldn't fully categorize, too complex to be simple hostility, something in it that might have been, very far down, the beginning of a recognition he wasn't ready to have. And then he walked through the door. Denton followed. The door closed. Nora turned to Harwick. You need to be in your bay. In a minute, he said. Your SAT was at 91 when I left you. It's 95 now. I checked. You checked. The aide showed me the number when I said I was getting up. I wasn't going to fall over. He looked at her. I needed to be here for that. She understood why, and the understanding sat uncomfortably, because she knew what it meant when someone who had been through what he'd been through felt that a thing needed witnessing, and she knew that her instinct to minimize it, to redirect him back to his bay, to keep the focus on clinical management, was partly professional and partly the habit of a person who had spent 3 years making herself smaller than she was. Okay, she said. Now go back. He went. The others drifted back toward their bays with the unhurried pace of people who have done the thing they came to do. Okafor stayed. What happens to Pruitt? She asked. That's not my jurisdiction, he said, but the documentation Denton's office pulled this morning is significant. Falsified readiness reports are a serious matter at the command level. The generator logs he deleted this morning. The system maintains backups he apparently didn't know about. The deletion itself is documented, which makes it worse than if he'd left the original records alone. She absorbed that. He tried to delete them, she said, while the patients were in the bay. While you were managing those patients, yes. She'd known it since Denton told her, but hearing it again made it more concrete. The image of Pruitt standing in the bay with his tablet while she was in the surgical suite with Adler, reaching back into the records to remove the evidence that would have proved she'd been right all along. He thought it would work, she said. Not quite to Okafor. Mostly to herself. He thought the complaint would be the story, Okafor said. Unauthorized procedures by a nurse operating outside her credentials. He probably had a version of events in his head where that was what medical affairs would spend the morning on, and the generator records were a side issue he could make disappear. Instead, medical affairs found the drill documentation. The falsified summary was in the same shared drive as the complaint records he pointed them toward. Okafor's expression was not quite satisfaction, but it had the quality of a man who has watched the architecture of a bad situation reveal itself. He handed them the thread that unraveled everything. She looked at the closed door of the consultation room. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel, she said. What did you think you'd feel? I don't know, something cleaner. Okafor nodded slowly. It's not clean, it's just true. The storm finished, not dramatically. Not with a clear moment of cessation, but in the gradual way that large weather events end, the wind dropping in increments, the rain losing its lateral force and becoming something more recognizably vertical. By noon, the outer bands had cleared enough for the first assessment teams to move through the station, and by early afternoon, the access roads were passable for emergency vehicles. The first transport came for Garrison at 2:17. She was there when they moved him. He was awake, pressure stable, and still pale in the specific way of someone who has lost significant blood volume and will stay that way for some time. He looked at her when the gurney came alongside. Transport to Coastal Regional, he said. Trauma Center, she confirmed. They're expecting you? Dr. Adler sent your operative notes ahead. He nodded. Then, you going to tell me your actual background now? You should focus on the transport. That's a no. That's a not right now. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. He didn't have the energy for a full smile, but the shape of one. Okafor told me some of it. Okafor talks too much, she said. He talks exactly the right amount, Garrison said. He always has. The transport team moved the gurney, and she walked alongside to the door, and at the threshold she stopped, and he kept going, and he looked back at her once with the flat, steady eyes she'd come to associate with him and said, "Thank you," which was 2 words that managed to carry the weight of everything they'd both been through in the past 9 hours. And then he was through the door, and she was standing in the entrance watching the transport vehicle move toward the access road. Sandra came up beside her. 4 more transports scheduled, Sandra said. The last 2 are staying for observation. Harwick stays through at least tomorrow, Nora said. His extubation was less than 6 hours ago, and I want his respiratory mechanics monitored overnight. Agreed. Sandra paused. The investigative team from Medical Command arrived 20 minutes ago. 3 people. They went straight to administration. I know. Pruitt's been in that consultation room for 4 hours. I know that too. Sandra was quiet for a moment, then, what happens to us? The department, I mean, if Pruitt goes? It was a fair question, the kind of practical question that gets lost in the larger narrative of institutional accountability, but matters enormously to the people who have to come in and do the work every day. Someone takes over interim, Nora said. The station command will appoint someone. The review process will probably take months. And you? She looked at Sandra. I'm not going anywhere today. That's not what I asked. She didn't have an answer for the actual question, so she told the truth about that. I don't know yet. The investigative team from Naval Medical Command worked through the afternoon with the methodical efficiency of people who have done this before and know that the pace of documentation matters as much as the pace of action. They were in Pruitt's office, in the records room, in the administrative suite where the emergency readiness reports were stored. They requested Nora's handwritten patient notes from the night, the slips of paper she'd been keeping now assembled into a rough but complete timeline, and she gave them copies and kept originals. They also requested her maintenance log. The manila folder, the one she'd been keeping since February in the corner of her desk on floor 4, the one she'd brought to Pruitt 6 separate times and been dismissed, the one she'd almost given to Captain Webb before his response had taught her that escalation within the system had a ceiling here. She handed it over without hesitation. The investigator, a lieutenant commander named Briggs, who had the no-nonsense precision of someone trained to find discrepancies in institutional paperwork, paged through it with a careful, focused attention. These are originals, Briggs said. The maintenance logs are copies I requested from the facilities office. The notes and correspondence are originals. The correspondence with Director Pruitt. 6 written reports, each with a date-stamped submission record from the hospital's internal document system. His responses were verbal. I documented them in the margin notes on each report with dates. Briggs looked up. You anticipated needing a record? I anticipated not being believed, she said. Which is different. Briggs held her gaze for a moment, then went back to the folder. What? At 4 in the afternoon, Pruitt emerged from the consultation room. She didn't see it directly. She was in Bay 2 with Harwick, going through a respiratory assessment. But she heard it, the particular sound of a door opening in a quiet corridor and the quality of footsteps that carry a specific kind of weight. She heard Marsh's voice, then Denton's, then a third voice she'd learned to recognize over the past 2 hours as Briggs. Then she heard nothing for a while. Then she heard Pruitt's voice, briefly, in a tone she'd never heard from him before. Not the controlled administration cadence, not the strategic quiet. Something smaller than either of those. Something that had the shape of a man who has arrived at the end of an argument he didn't know he was losing until it was over. Harwick was watching her. Something's happening, he said. Probably. Good something or bad something? Complicated something, she said. Breathe for me. Deep breath. Hold, release. He did it. His lung sounds were clear, bilateral, improving. The chest tube site was clean. His color was better than it had been at any point since the helicopter. You're doing well, she said. I've had good care, he said. We've been through this conversation. And I'm having it again because it's true and because you should know it. She set down the stethoscope. How's the pain? Manageable. The stuff they gave me at 8 this morning is wearing off. I'll have the attending order another dose. Before you go. He stopped her before she reached the curtain. What Okafor said. In the corridor. All of it. She waited. Was he right? Harwick said. About why you left. She looked at him for a moment. He had the particular quality that some patients develop after a significant medical event. A temporary but real stripping away of the conversational filters. The thing where proximity to a serious outcome makes people direct in ways they wouldn't normally be. He was right about most of it, she said. The corpsman you lost. Yes. That's not a reason to walk away from medicine. It was a reason to walk away from command decisions. She kept her voice even. There's a difference. Is there? She looked at him. Harwick. I'm not trying to push you, he said. I'm asking because I've known people who walked away from things they were good at because of the cost of being good at them. And I've seen what that does to people over time. What does it do? It makes them very good at the quieter version of the same thing, he said, and quietly miserable. She stood with that for a moment. Get some rest, she said. She went through the curtain before he could respond. Pruitt's office was on the administrative side of the building, past the HR suite and the records room, down a corridor that she had walked 3 times in 3 years for meetings that had never gone the way she'd hoped. She went there now, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she needed to see what was there. The door was open. Marsh was inside, standing at the desk, and Briggs was beside her, and they were going through the drawers of Pruitt's desk with the measured process of a formal search. They were not looking at her when she appeared in the doorway, and for a moment she just stood there watching the particular choreography of institutional accountability actually functioning, which was different from how she'd imagined it would look. She'd imagined it would feel like justice, immediate and clear. It felt more like the morning after a storm. The damage visible, the cleanup slow, the ground still wet, nothing put back yet. Marsh looked up. Callahan, she said. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting. Marsh looked at her with an expression that had moved significantly from this morning's careful administrative neutrality into something more direct. We're going to need a formal statement from you. Full timeline, your documented concerns, the response you received. Everything in writing. I can do that. Tomorrow is fine. Today's been... Marsh paused, which was the closest she came to acknowledging the weight of the past 12 hours. Today's been a lot. Yes, Nora said. Marsh looked at her. For the record, the procedures you performed tonight, the needle decompression, the intubation, the surgical assist. In my professional assessment, those interventions were appropriate, necessary, and correctly executed. I want that stated clearly. Nora nodded. Director Pruitt's complaint, Marsh continued, is being set aside pending the outcomes of the broader review, which, given what we've found today, is going to be a very thorough review. What did you find? Nora asked. She said it directly because she'd stopped performing careful deference somewhere around the 6-hour mark of the morning and wasn't sure she had it back yet. Marsh looked at Briggs. A brief professional exchange of glances. The falsified drill summary is the most significant documented irregularity, Marsh said. The generator access log deletion is a separate matter. There's also a pattern in the supply audit records that suggests some reporting discrepancies going back approximately 14 months. The supply audit, Nora said. The numbers submitted to command don't match what's actually in inventory. We're still establishing the scope, but it's possible that some of the supply inadequacies you documented in your reports were larger than even you knew. She stood with that. He knew the supplies were short, she said. When those men came in off that helicopter, he told me to leave the bag I'd brought. He knew I had the only adequate chest seal material in the department, and he told me to leave it. Yes, Marsh said. That's in Fitch's statement. Fitch gave a statement? Fitch, Sandra Oduya, and 2 other staff members who were present during the early phase of the event. They gave statements this afternoon. Marsh's expression was still controlled, but something in it had the quality of a woman who has seen enough of institutional failure to find this case particularly clear. Nobody contradicted your account. Nobody came close. Nora looked at the desk, at the open drawers, at the folder of accumulated documentation that Briggs was systematically photographing. "What happens to the facility during the review?" she said. "Interim director will be appointed from station command. Hospital operations continue. Oversight will be close." Marsh paused. "We're going to need someone to consult on the emergency protocol reconstruction. The mass casualty plan needs to be rewritten, and the generator situation needs immediate remediation." "I have a draft," Nora said. Marsh blinked. "You have a draft of the mass casualty plan." "I wrote it after the tabletop drill. I couldn't get anyone to read it, so I kept it." She paused. "The generator remediation steps are in the maintenance log I gave Briggs this morning." Marsh looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "Of course you do," Marsh said. At 6:20, Pruitt left the building. He came out through the main entrance rather than the administrative side exit, which meant he walked through the lobby past the reception desk and the waiting area and the corridor that connected to the emergency department. And by that point, enough of the staff had returned to the building following the storm that there were people to see him go. He was not in handcuffs. This was not that kind of leaving. He was carrying his jacket over one arm and his personal effects in a box that one of the administrative aides had packed, and he was walking with his chin up in the particular way of someone who has decided that the manner of an exit matters more than its circumstances. He passed the entrance to the emergency department. She was standing at the nurse's station, writing her patient notes into the electronic system, which had come back online at 5:30 when emergency power was restored. She looked up when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. Their eyes met for a moment, less than 3 seconds, across the 15 feet of corridor between them. He kept walking. She went back to her notes. Fitch appeared at her elbow 10 seconds later. "That was something." "Yes," she said. "He didn't say anything to you?" "No." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "Does that bother you?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I wanted him to understand what he did," she said finally. "I don't need him to say it to me, but I wanted him to understand it." "Do you think he does?" "I think he understands that it didn't work out the way he planned. That's not the same thing." Fitch nodded slowly. "No, it's not." She finished the note she was writing, saved it, and moved to the next patient. Okafor found her at 7:15 when the department had settled into the quiet of a post-event evening. The remaining patients monitored and stable, the transport vehicles gone. The investigative team's work paused until morning. He sat down across from her in the break room, the way people sit when they've been on their feet for too long and have something to say. "The authorization document," he said. "Page 2. I read it." "And?" She looked at her coffee. "It's a request, not an order." "That's correct." "People seem to think because I can do this work, I should be doing it in a different context." "People think that because they watched you tonight and they've seen your record and it's a reasonable conclusion. My record includes a corpsman who died under my supervision. Your record also includes 47 documented saves in forward surgical environments, 2 decorated actions, and 6 men who went home tonight on transport vehicles because you were here." Okafor's voice was level. "Every good medical officer I've ever worked with has a patient they couldn't save. The ones who can't live with that shouldn't be in the field. The ones who let it hollow them out shouldn't be in command. But the ones who carry it and keep going," he paused, "those are the ones people trust their lives to." She didn't answer. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do," he said. "I'm telling you what I observed tonight. You can do with that what you want." "What happens if I say no?" "Then you go back to floor 4. Or you stay in the emergency department, which is where you'll end up once the new director is in place and the credentials are updated. And you keep doing good work, and patients keep being better off for having you here." He looked at her. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not. But it's not everything you are either." She sat with that. The break room was quiet. The coffee was terrible, the institutional kind, which was the same everywhere she'd ever been. "The corpsman's name was Reyes," she said. It was the first time she had said his name aloud in 3 years. He was 24. He'd been with the unit for 7 months. Okafor said nothing, which was the right response. We had 2 patients and 2 critical interventions, and I triaged him as the more stable one, and I was wrong. He arrested 20 minutes after I moved to the other patient, and we couldn't get him back. She kept her voice even. I'd made that call 100 times. I got it right 100 times. That time, I didn't. And you decided that meant you shouldn't be making calls anymore. I decided I shouldn't be making calls where the stakes were that high. But the stakes tonight, I know, she said. I know what the stakes were tonight. He waited. I wasn't thinking about whether I was qualified, she said. I was just working. I wasn't... She stopped, found the word. I wasn't afraid of it. I was just doing the next thing. Yes, Okafor said. I know. She looked at him. That's what everyone saw, he said. Not that you were brave, not that you were exceptional, that you just did the next thing, whatever it was, without hesitation. She thought about the needle on the roof in the dark, the tube in the bay by flashlight, Garrison saying, I can keep moving when his numbers had been falling. She thought about Reyes. She thought about the way the authorization document looked on Denton's tablet, the Admiral's signature, the request on page 2, the name she hadn't heard spoken in 3 years. I need to think, she said. Take whatever time you need, Okafor said. He stood. We're here through at least Thursday. Harwick longer, probably. I know. He went to the door, stopped. One more thing. The statement Pruitt gave to Marsh this afternoon. She looked up. He claims the deletion of the generator records was accidental, that he was trying to access a different file and made a selection error. An error, she said, at 2:14 in the morning during an active mass casualty event on a system he apparently accessed while simultaneously placing a complaint call to medical affairs. She stared at him. The access log, Okafor continued, shows that he spent 4 minutes and 32 seconds in the generator maintenance file before the deletion occurred. The system records cursor movement and document open times, 4 minutes and 32 seconds. He met her eyes. That's what Briggs told me 20 minutes ago. I thought you should know. She sat very still. He's going to fight it, she said. Probably. He'll get a lawyer. He'll say the logs are misinterpreted. He'll argue he was trying to retrieve records to support the complaint, not delete them. Possibly, Okafor said. But Briggs also found something in the deleted file's recovery data. When the system backup restored the deleted records, it restored the metadata too. He paused. The original generator service records that should have been in that file, the actual service records showing the 2 load test failures, they weren't there. The file contained replacement documents, clean service records dated 3 weeks after the actual test failures, showing passing results. The room was very quiet. He didn't delete the real records tonight, she said slowly. No, Okafor said. Tonight he tried to delete the fake ones. She understood then, the full shape of it, the things she'd been missing. He hadn't just failed to act on her reports. He'd known the generator was compromised because he'd already been managing the documentation of it, the falsified drill summary, the supply audit discrepancies, the replacement service records. This wasn't negligence. This was a maintained architecture of false safety that had been in place for months before she ever walked into his office with her first highlighted log. She had been right about the generator. She had not known how right she was. And somewhere in a folder that Briggs's team was currently photographing in Pruitt's office, there were records that would tell a much longer and more deliberate story than the one anyone had been examining this morning. She stood up. She went to the window. Outside, the storm had finished. The sky over Delacove Naval Station was clear in the particular way of post-storm nights. The air scrubbed clean, the dark deeper than usual, every light on the base casting its reflection in the standing water that lay across every surface. It was quiet in the way that places are quiet after something loud has finished, a silence with texture, with the memory of noise inside it. Her reflection in the window was there again. She looked at it. Behind her, Okafor had left, and the break room was empty, and the department was quiet. And in Bay 2, a man who had reached for her badge in the dark was sleeping with clear lung sounds and improving oxygen saturation. And in the administrative wing, a team of investigators was working through the architecture of a lie that had been carefully maintained for months. And tomorrow there would be statements and formal reviews, and the slow institutional work of consequence, which was not clean and was not fast, but was real. She looked at her reflection. She thought about what Harwick had said. Quietly miserable. And the thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong, and she knew he wasn't wrong, and she'd known it before he said it, which was why it had landed the way it did. She had been good at the quieter version. She had not been happy in it. She picked up her phone. The Admiral's number was on page 2 of the authorization document, which Denton had sent to her hospital email at some point during the afternoon without explanation or instruction. Just the document in her inbox and the number at the bottom of the second page. She looked at it. She put the phone down. Not yet. Not tonight. With the storm just finished and Garrison on a transport and Harwick's lung sound still fresh in her memory and the shape of everything still settling into whatever it was going to be. She picked up her coffee instead. She went back to her patient notes. She was 3 entries into the electronic record when the door opened and Briggs came in, and Briggs's expression was not the careful neutral of a person managing a process. It was the expression of someone who has found something significant enough that they came to find the relevant person immediately rather than waiting until morning. "We pulled the complete backup recovery from the generator file," Briggs said. "There's a full document trail going back 22 months. Nora waited. "The first set of replacement records was created 4 months before you submitted your first written report to Director Pruitt. 4 months. "He knew before I came to him," she said. "He created the replacement documentation 11 days after the first load test failure. Before anyone filed a report, before anyone formally raised the concern." Briggs's voice was precise and flat. "There's more. The replacement records, the ones he created, they weren't created by him directly. The metadata shows a user account that belongs to the facilities manager." "That's Yarnell," Nora said. "Carl Yarnell." "Yes. We're going to want to talk to him tomorrow morning." Briggs looked at her. "And we're going to want your complete timeline, every interaction you had with Pruitt regarding the generator, the drill, the supply reports, every date, every response, everything you remember." "I have it," she said, "in the log." "I know. I want the full version." Briggs paused at the door. "One more thing. Pruitt's access card was used to enter the medical records server room at 11:40 last night. Before the storm fully hit, before the helicopter, before any of the events of the morning." "What's in the server room?" Nora asked, already knowing. "The backup archives for personnel files," Briggs said, "including, among other things, the file that would have contained your prior service record." She felt something go very cold and very clear in her chest. "He knew," she said, "before the storm. He pulled my personnel file before the helicopter even landed." "The access log shows a specific file query," Briggs said. "Your name." She stood in the break room with her terrible coffee and the post-storm quiet outside, and the full shape of it assembled now, every piece in place. The file accessed the night before, the complaint filed while the patients were in the bay, the generator records he'd tried to delete, the replacement documents he'd created 22 months ago. Not a man who had failed to respond to her concerns, but a man who had known the truth of her concerns before she ever voiced them, and had spent 2 years building a structure designed to survive the moment she did. And then the helicopter had landed, and the structure had come apart. Not because of the investigation, not because of Okafor's calls or Denton's review or Briggs's document trail, because 6 men had needed someone to keep them alive. And the only person in the building qualified to do it was the person Pruitt had spent 3 years trying to make small enough to ignore. She set down her coffee. She looked at Briggs. "What time tomorrow?" she said. 8 o'clock, Briggs said. "If that works." "It works," she said. Briggs left. She stood in the break room alone for a moment, and then she did the thing she'd done at the window during the surgery. She looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds, which was the duration she'd allowed herself in harder situations than this, and then she picked up her pen and went back to her patient notes. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And tomorrow, for the first time in 3 years, the work was going to look different than it had the day before. The statement took 4 hours. She sat across from Briggs in the consultation room on Thursday morning with her maintenance log open between them and her handwritten patient notes stacked to one side, and she went through everything, not in the order it had happened to her emotionally, but in the order it had happened chronologically, which was the order that would matter when someone assembled this into a formal record. First report, February of the previous year. Second report, April. The tabletop drill in March, and what she had observed versus what the summary said. The conversation in Pruitt's office where he had looked at her highlighted generator logs for 4 seconds and told her he'd have someone look into it. Every date, every response, every follow-up that had gone nowhere. Briggs recorded it and asked clarifying questions and did not offer expressions of sympathy or outrage, which Nora appreciated, because what she needed from this conversation was precision, not comfort. At one point, Briggs set down her pen and said, "Did you ever consider going outside the chain? A hotline, an external oversight body?" "Yes," Nora said. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly. "I thought if I just kept doing it right, kept documenting, kept escalating within the system, eventually someone would pay attention. That the system would work if I gave it enough time to work." And I was wrong about that, she said, which is a thing I'd tell myself differently if I could do it over. Briggs looked at her. "That's in the record." "Good," Nora said. The formal findings came 3 weeks later, which was faster than institutional timelines usually moved and reflected the specific gravity of what the investigation had found. She read them in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon. The document sent to her hospital email by Denton's office with no accompanying note, just the PDF, which was the official language for "here's what happened," formally. Randall Pruitt was terminated effective immediately, his termination classified as dismissal for cause, which was the specific category that followed a person through the rest of their professional life and closed certain doors permanently. The grounds were documented in 17 pages. Falsification of emergency readiness reports submitted to Naval Station Command, alteration of equipment maintenance records, creation of false documentation covering generator service failures, and the deletion attempt during the active emergency event, which the investigation had ultimately characterized not as accidental but as deliberate, based on the 4-minute and 32-second access log and the metadata trail of what he had tried to remove and why. Carl Yarnell, the facilities manager whose user account had been used to create the original replacement generator records, had cooperated with the investigation in exchange for a reduced administrative penalty. His cooperation had confirmed what the metadata had suggested. Pruitt had directed him to create the false documents and had provided the language for what they should say. Yarnell had done it because Pruitt had been his supervisor and he hadn't felt he had a choice, which was the kind of answer that was both entirely understandable and not a sufficient defense, and the investigation had treated it as both. The falsified drill summary had been created by Pruitt personally, using an administrative access credential that bypassed the normal document management system. The investigation found 2 additional falsified readiness reports beyond the drill summary, quarterly submissions to command that had shown green across all categories during periods when multiple systems were in known failure states. The supply audit discrepancies traced to a procurement irregularity that the investigation referred to a separate financial review. The details of that were not in Nora's copy of the findings. She read the 17 pages without stopping. Then she read the final section, which was the part that addressed her directly. A formal finding that her 6 written safety reports had been legitimate, documented concerns meeting the threshold for mandatory action under Naval Medical Command's facility oversight protocols. That Pruitt's failure to act on those reports, combined with his active falsification of the records that would have substantiated them, had created the conditions for the emergency event. That the actions she had taken during that event were consistent with her training and qualifications, and had directly contributed to the survival of 6 military personnel. At the bottom of the final section was a single paragraph that stated that her prior credentials had been formally reinstated in the Naval Medical Command personnel system, effective retroactively to the date she had left service, and that her civilian employment record at Merrick Naval Medical Center had been amended to reflect her full qualifications. She set down the document. She sat in the break room for a while. She was not crying, which she'd half expected. She was not relieved in the clean, sudden way that she'd imagined relief might feel after a long time of not having it. She was something more complicated, a mixture of things that didn't have a single name, some of which were quiet and some of which were tired, and some of which were, underneath everything else, a kind of recognition, not satisfaction exactly, more like the feeling of a sentence that has been unfinished for a long time finally reaching its period. She picked up her phone and called Okafor. He answered on the second ring. "I read the findings," she said. "I know. Denton called me this morning. Garrison is out of the ICU. I heard he's going to be pissed about the scar. Tell him it builds character." A pause that had warmth in it. "How are you?" "Complicated," she said. "But okay. That sounds about right." She looked at her coffee. "I made a phone call last week." "I know that too," Okafor said. "You know everything." "I know the things that matter to my people," he said. "What did the Admiral say?" She said, "Take my time." She said, "The position is there when I'm ready." She said, Nora paused, finding the exact words because they mattered. She said, "The work I did at Merrick for 3 years counted, that it wasn't a detour, that building emergency protocols for a civilian naval hospital and trying to fix a broken system from the inside was exactly the kind of work the medical corps needed people willing to do." "She's right," Okafor said. She also said Reyes's family has been notified that his case is being reviewed, that the triage decision from that mission has been formally re-examined by a board and reclassified as a reasonable judgment call under combat conditions. Nora kept her voice steady, which required some effort, that I was not found to have been negligent. Silence on the line. "How long have you been carrying that?" Okafor said. 3 years. "And now?" She looked at the window. The sky outside was an ordinary Tuesday blue, the kind of sky that didn't ask anything of anyone. "Now I'm going to figure out what to do with putting it down," she said. 2. Harwick was discharged on a Friday, 8 days after the storm. He came to find her before he left, which she'd expected, because he was the kind of person who finished the conversations he started. He found her in the emergency department, doing what she'd been doing since the new interim director. A steady, unflashy captain named Rowan, who had arrived from Naval Station Beaufort and immediately read every report Nora had ever filed, had asked her to lead the emergency protocol reconstruction. She was working. She was always working. He stood in the doorway in civilian clothes, which made him look different, less like a patient, more like a person, which was the particular transformation that happened when someone recovered enough to wear their own things again. "You're leaving," she said. "Cleared this morning?" He crossed his arms. "Respiratory mechanics perfect, apparently." "I told you they would be." "You told me they were improving. There's a difference." She almost smiled. "How's the chest wall?" "Sore? Functional?" He looked at her. "Are you staying here?" "For now. There's work to do before I go anywhere." "What kind of work?" "The mass casualty plan needs to be fully implemented. The generator remediation is scheduled for next month. There's a training program for the emergency staff that nobody has run in 2 years." She looked at him. "The kind of work that should have been done before any of this happened." "And after that?" She thought about page 2 of the authorization document, which she'd read enough times that she had the shape of it memorized without having meant to. "After that," she said, "I think I'm going to stop hiding what I am." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. "Just that." He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was solid, which meant the arm was healing correctly, and she noticed that the way she noticed everything. As clinical data, as evidence of an outcome, as proof that the work had worked. "Calloway," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For the ditch in Caraman, and for the bay last week, and for the 3 years in between when you kept showing up and doing the work, even when nobody was watching." She held his gaze. "People were watching," she said. "They just weren't saying anything." He nodded once. He left. The public portion of what happened to Pruitt came through the Naval Station's administrative bulletin 6 weeks after the storm, which was the official vehicle for personnel actions, and it was as plain and institutional as those things always were. A notice of termination for cause, the specific grounds listed in formal language that made the severity clear without being dramatic about it. It ran to 2 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs that ended a career built on 20 years of managing appearances, maintaining false documentation, and systematically dismissing the people who told the truth about what he was doing. She read it the same way she'd read the findings. in the break room, alone, without ceremony. What she felt was not triumph. She'd been wrong to expect triumph, she understood now. What she felt was something closer to what you feel at the end of a long illness. Not the joy of health, exactly, but the absence of something that had been present so long you'd stopped recognizing it as weight until it was gone. The hospital felt different without him in it. It felt like a place that might work correctly now, which was the thing she'd wanted from the beginning. Not vindication, not recognition, just the basic functioning of a medical facility the way it was supposed to function. Generators that were tested, protocols that reflected reality, supplies that matched the records, staff who could raise a concern without being made to feel like a problem. That was what 3 years of reports had been about. Not herself. The patients. It had always been about the patients. Captain Rowan called her into his office on a Wednesday morning 5 weeks after he'd arrived, which was not unprecedented. He consulted her regularly on the protocol work, which had become a collaboration that neither of them had expected and both of them had found productive. He was a man who asked direct questions and listened to the answers, which was, she'd realized, not a low bar for a supervisor, but it felt like one after 3 years of the alternative. "I have a request from Naval Medical Command," he said. "Formal request. It came to me because you're technically still assigned here, but it's really directed at you." "Okay." "They want to use the emergency protocol you drafted as a template for 6 other naval medical facilities." He looked at her. "With your involvement in the adaptation process, site visits, consultation, training delivery." She looked at him. "That's a significant scope," she said. "It's a significant protocol," he said. "Briggs apparently mentioned to someone at Medical Command that you had a draft ready before the storm, that you'd had it ready for over a year." He looked at her steadily. "The draft that nobody here would read." "Yes." "They read it now." She sat with that for a moment. The particular irony of it, the thing that was almost funny if you tilted your head the right way. A document she had written in her own time, on her own laptop, in the apartment she went home to after shifts, where her concerns had been dismissed, a document she'd carried for 14 months without anyone asking to see it. Now 6 medical facilities were going to implement it. "I'll do the consultation," she said. "Good." Rowan leaned back. "And separately, the Admiral's offer, have you decided?" She looked at him. She hadn't told him about page 2. She didn't know how he knew. "Okafor," she said. "He mentioned it in passing," Rowan said. "He has a particular definition of in passing that most people would call very directly." She looked at the window. The position on page 2 was a medical advisory role attached to a special operations command, not field work, not the forward surgical environments of her earlier career, but the work of designing the systems that kept field medical teams functional, training the people who would be in those positions, writing the protocols that would be used in the situation she knew better than almost anyone how to prepare for. It was the work between the emergencies which was, she'd come to understand, the work that determined whether the emergencies could be survived. It was the work she'd been doing at Merrick for 3 years, in the wrong place, without the authority to make it stick. "I've decided," she said. Rowan nodded once. "When?" he said. "After the protocol consultations, after the training program here is running without me." She looked at him. "This place needs to work correctly before I leave it." "Agreed," he said. "And it will." She stood to go. "Callahan," he said. She turned. "For the record, what you did here, the 3 years of reports before the storm, not just the night itself, that's the part of this that should be remembered." He held her gaze with the plain directness she'd come to rely on. "Anyone can perform under pressure. The harder thing is staying accurate about what's broken when nobody will listen. That's what you did." She stood in his doorway. "I had some help," she said finally, "from 6 men on a helicopter who decided to land here instead of somewhere else." "The helicopter landed here because it was the closest facility," Rowan said. "I know," she said. "Sometimes that's how it works." She called her mother on a Sunday, which was when she usually called, and she told her most of it: the storm, the patients, the findings, the new position she'd accepted. Her mother listened the way she always listened, which was quietly and completely. And at the end she said, "You sound different." "Different how?" "Less like you're keeping something out," her mother said. Nora looked at the window of her apartment. Outside, the Della Cove waterfront was doing its ordinary Sunday thing. Joggers, dog walkers, a few boats still running despite the season getting late. "I think I was," she said, "for a long time." What changed? She thought about how to answer that, and the honest answer was complicated. It was a helicopter and a hurricane and a man with a tablet trying to delete records while 6 people needed her hands. And it was Harwick reaching for her badge in the dark. And it was Garrison saying, "I can keep moving," with a blood pressure that said otherwise. And it was 3 years of lunches eaten alone and reports that went into a drawer and the specific grinding fatigue of being right about something in a place that had decided you were wrong. But it was also something quieter than all of that. Something she'd been close to for a long time without quite letting herself reach it. "I stopped waiting to be believed," she said. "I just did the work, and then other people had to decide what to do with what they saw." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That's all you ever needed to do," she said. "I know," Nora said. "It just took me a while to figure out that the doing was enough, that I didn't need to convince anyone. I just needed to keep showing up." The night before she left Merrick, she went back to the emergency department after her shift ended. It was late, the quiet hours, when the department ran on skeleton coverage and the kind of sustained low-level attention that night shifts required. The new staff she'd helped train were running their stations correctly. The supply inventory matched the records. She knew because she'd built the audit system that ensured it would. The backup generator had been replaced 3 weeks ago, tested under full load twice, and the service records were accurate, complete, and stored in a system that required 2-person access for any modification. She stood in the doorway of Bay 2, the bay where Harwick had been, where she'd intubated him in the dark with a battery-powered laryngoscope and a flashlight held by an aide who'd counted breaths out loud because she'd asked him to. The bay was empty now, clean and ready, the way emergency bays should be. She looked at it for a while. She thought about what she'd said to her mother, and she thought about what Okafor had said, the ones who carry it and keep going. And she thought about the particular shape of the 3 years she'd spent in this building, which had not been what she'd expected when she arrived and had not been wasted, which was the thing she'd needed to understand and had finally understood. You don't waste time trying to fix something broken, even when the system refuses to fix itself. You don't waste time telling the truth in a room that won't hear it. The work is real regardless of whether anyone is watching. The patients who got better care because she was paying attention, they got better care. The documents she kept, the logs she maintained, the protocol she drafted on her own time in her own apartment, those were real things that had real consequences, even when the consequences were delayed, even when the delay lasted 3 years. The institutions that refuse to hear warnings will eventually face the thing they weren't warned about in time. She had done the warning. She had also been there when the thing arrived. Both of those mattered. Both had always mattered. She turned off the light in Bay 2. She walked through the department one more time. Not dramatically, not slowly, just with the ordinary attention she'd given it every day for 3 years, noting what was working and what might need attention and where the weak points were, because that was how she'd always moved through this space, and it was not a habit she was going to lose. Everything looked the way it should. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the building. The parking lot of Merrick Naval Medical Center was empty at this hour, lit by the standard lot lights, which was exactly what a parking lot should be. Unremarkable, functional, doing its small job in the ordinary darkness. She got in her car. She sat for a moment. She thought about Reyes the way she did most nights, which was a habit she'd tried to break and had stopped trying to break because it was part of who she was, and who she was had turned out to be someone she could live inside. She thought about his 24 years and his 7 months with the unit and the triage call that she'd made in the dark with 2 seconds to decide. And she held all of that the way she'd learned to hold it. Not lightly, not without weight, but without the particular suffocating quality it had carried for 3 years when she'd been trying to use it as a reason to make herself smaller. It was not a reason to be smaller. It was a reason to be precise. It was a reason to stay current and trained and honest about risk and to fight for the systems that kept people alive before the emergencies happened, and to show up when the emergencies happened anyway. It was, in the end, a reason to keep going. She started the car. She drove out of the lot and onto the access road and toward the station gate, and through the gate and onto the coast road where the Atlantic was visible to her right, black and enormous and ordinary the way large things are ordinary when you see them every day. She had an early morning. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and for the first time in 3 years, the work was going to be done by the full version of herself. Not the version she'd trimmed down to fit a space that had decided she was too much, but the version that had trained for a decade and documented for 3 years and stayed in that hospital through a Category 3 hurricane and kept 6 men alive in the dark with what she had. That version had been there the whole time. She had just needed a hurricane to stop pretending otherwise. The road stretched ahead of her, wet from last week's rain, reflecting headlights back in long orange streaks, and she drove into it without looking back, which was not the same as forgetting where she'd been. It just meant she knew where she was going.